When a falcon is born under open skies, it does not know the weight of crowns or maps. Yet some are born not just to fly, but to command the winds themselves. In the boundless sea of grass that was the Mongolian steppe, where wind whispered through the bone-dry reeds and the stars sang in solitude, a boy was born who would one day unite heaven and earth in the form of a dynasty. His name was Kublai, son of Tolui, grandson of Genghis Khan. But he was not just a warrior. He was the inheritor of a dream that went beyond conquest, a vision of rule, of transformation, of legacy. This is the story of how he became the most powerful man of his age. Kublai Khan was born in the year 1215, during a time of relentless expansion. The Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan, had erupted like a storm from the steppe, crushing cities and shattering empires from China to the Caspian. Kublai's birth occurred in the midst of war, in the wind-bitten plains of northern Mongolia, to a world where a man's name was carried further by the hooves of horses than by ink. His father, Tolui, was Genghis Khan's fourth son, a man of quiet lethality and iron loyalty. But it was his mother, Sorghaghtani, who would define the course of Kublai's life more than any sword or saddle. Sorghaghtani was no ordinary Mongol noblewoman. She was a Karaite Christian princess, wise, politically astute, and fiercely ambitious. She understood that empires were not built by war alone, but by knowledge, diplomacy, and cultural mastery. And so, from his earliest days, Kublai was caught between two worlds: the wild nomadic freedom of his forefathers and the literate, structured elegance of Chinese civilization. At age 6, when most Mongol boys were learning to ride bareback and shoot from horseback, Kublai was already being instructed in classical Chinese texts, Confucian ethics, and statecraft. Sorghaghtani invited Chinese scholars, Buddhist monks, and Persian advisors into their camp. Among them was Liu Bingjong, a former Jin official and learned Confucian scholar, who became one of Kublai's earliest tutors. If you wish to rule China, Liu once told the young prince, you must learn to speak to its soul, not just command its flesh. Kublai listened. By the time he was in his teens, he had mastered not only archery and military drill, but the Analects, the Book of Changes, and the Five Elements theory. He spoke Mongolian, but read Chinese. He memorized the genealogies of Tang emperors as easily as he recited the stories of his grandfather's conquests. In the twilight campfires of the steppes, he was often found not with a bow in hand, but with a scroll, a sight that drew both admiration and suspicion among the warriors. In 1251, Kublai's elder brother, Marco Khan, ascended to the title of Great Khan, becoming ruler of the entire Mongol Empire. Marco, while loyal to tradition, saw the value in his younger brother's hybrid talents. He appointed Kublai as the governor of northern China, a test, but also a vote of immense trust. Kublai was not given an empire. He was given a fractured land, seething with rebellion, populated by scholars who viewed Mongols as savages, and bureaucrats trained to see imperial rule as a mandate from heaven. But Kublai understood the stakes. He did not just ride into China with soldiers, he brought reform, understanding, and order. He adopted Chinese administrative systems, retained Han officials, protected peasants from corrupt tax collectors, and even lowered grain levies during famines. His court became a strange but effective amalgamation of Mongol warriors, Persian engineers, and Chinese scholars, and in doing so, he began to earn what no other Mongol had: the trust of the Chinese people. Yet with every reform, Kublai faced criticism from his own people. The older Mongol generals whispered, he eats with chopsticks. He dresses like a Han noble. He forgets the tent. His own soul was divided. At night, he dreamt of the wind-swept plains, of riding beneath a sky unbroken by stone or hierarchy. Yet when he opened his eyes, he saw maps, ledgers, ministers, and scholars. He began to ask himself, could a son of the steppes also become a ruler of cities? Could the blood of Genghis Khan command not only fear, but peace? That question would soon be answered by war. As Kublai began consolidating his rule in the north, and tensions flared with the southern Song dynasty, which still ruled the south of China. To the Song, Kublai was a barbarian warlord in silks. To Kublai, the Song were the final obstacle to unifying all of China. And then, in 1259, tragedy struck. Mongol Khan died during the siege of Diaoyucheng. His death plunged the empire into a succession crisis, and Kublai, once content to serve, was now drawn into the battle for the very throne of the Mongol world. In a wind-swept tent, pitched on the edge of the Yellow River, Kublai stood over a map of all Asia. The ink had begun to blur, not from time, but from tears. He no longer had the luxury of being a student of empires. He had to become one. "If fate wills it," he whispered, "then I shall wear both the crown of the Khans and the dragon robe of the emperors." The stars above did not answer, but they watched, and history began to lean forward. To rule one land is to wear a crown. To rule all lands is to survive the War of Brothers. Mongol Khan was dead. The winds of the Mongol Empire, once unified under one banner, now scattered across mountains and deserts like ashes from a dying fire. And in the echo of Mongol's fall, two great forces began to rise, both claiming the right to rule the world forged by Genghis Khan. One was Kublai, already respected for his governance of northern China. The other was Arik Boka, the youngest brother, the traditionalist, backed by the conservative core of the Mongol heartlands. It would not be a war of invaders and rebels, but of brothers, visions, and survival. When Mongke perished at Diaoyucheng in 1259, news traveled fast but not evenly. Kublai, besieging a southern Song fortress in present-day Sichuan, received the message amid the chaos of war. He knew immediately what this meant. The Kurultai, the traditional Mongol council of nobles, would need to choose a new great Khan. But this was no longer the world of Genghis. The empire had fractured into complex territories. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and Kublai's own sphere in China. The dream of a united Mongol world was fading. Kublai had a choice: abandon the war in China or make a bid for ultimate power. He chose both. In 1260, Kublai gathered his loyal nobles and hosted a Kurultai in Kaiping, modern-day Inner Mongolia, near his Chinese power base. There, with thunder rolling on the horizon and drums beating like war horses, he was declared Great Khan. But in the same year, Arik Boka held his own Kurultai in Karakorum, the ancestral Mongol capital, and proclaimed himself Great Khan as well. For the first time in Mongol history, the title was contested. What followed was not just a civil war, but a clash of ideologies. Arik Boka represented the steppe, tradition, and the central Mongol elite. Kublai represented civilization, hybrid rule, and the path toward empire beyond the saddle. Between 1260 and 1264, the steppes thundered with civil war. Kublai's forces, seasoned from years of fighting the southern Song, and led by generals like Uriang Kadai and Bayan, moved swiftly. Arik Boka, though bold, was under-resourced and struggled to feed his troops in the harsher lands of Mongolia. Kublai utilized not only military tactics, but economic warfare. He cut off supplies to Karakorum, secured grain routes from China, and used diplomacy to win over vassal khans. Even the princes of the Golden Horde and Ilkhanate began leaning toward Kublai. The steppes whispered a shift in the wind. One of the decisive confrontations took place near Erdene-Zu, close to the old Mongol capital. Here, the two sides met in a brutal conflict that saw cousins pitted against cousins, arrows darkening the sky. Arik Boka's traditional cavalry charges were met with crossbow units, Chinese-engineered siege engines, and a diverse, coordinated command structure Kublai had refined over years of governing multi-ethnic territories. Victory was slow, but inevitable. By 1264, Arik Boka was forced to surrender. He knelt before his brother, not as kin, but as conquered. "You are not the Khan of Genghis," he spat, "but the emperor of another people." To that, Kublai said nothing. He didn't need to. History had already chosen. With his brother imprisoned, Kublai did not return to Karakorum. Instead, he turned toward the south, toward Dadu, the city he would build into Beijing. He recognized that the heart of his rule was no longer on the steppes, but in the ancient bureaucratic rhythms of the Chinese world. In 1271, he would officially declare the founding of the Yuan Dynasty, but its roots were planted the day Arik Boka fell. He was no longer just a Khan. He was becoming Huangdi Emperor, and in that transformation, The Mongol Empire itself began to change. Yet, Kublai paid dearly for victory. The unity of the Mongol Empire was broken. Civil war had weakened the imperial prestige. Karakorum lost its centrality. Many Mongol nobles would never again trust the Chinese-leaning court. Kublai knew that he had won the world, but lost his blood. "I have conquered the shadow of Genghis," he would later say, but not his peace. Still, from the ashes of fratricide, a new kind of empire was rising. One that would reach its full form under the dragon seal of Yuan. On a spring morning in Kaiping, Kublai stood alone on a stone balcony overlooking his court. Scholars bowed in silence. War banners fluttered beside Confucian scrolls. He wore the robe of a Chinese emperor, but his eyes searched the horizon for galloping riders. "The steppe made me," he murmured, "but China will remember me." Behind him, in the Hall of Ancestors, the names of Khans were being inscribed on gold tablets, and his own was etched deeper than any. It is not enough to seize a throne. One must build a world that believes it belongs to you. Kublai Khan had conquered his brother, inherited the title of Great Khan, and subdued the lands of northern China. But his greatest challenge lay not in war, it lay in legitimacy. He could command 100,000 riders, but could he win the mandate of heaven? This chapter is the story of how a Mongol warlord became the founding emperor of a Chinese dynasty, and how the winds of the steppe were woven into silk. In 1267, Kublai ordered the construction of a new capital city, Dadu, the great capital. Known today as Beijing, this was no mere administrative move. Kublai envisioned a city that would be the heart of a new imperial order, one that reflected both Mongol dominance and Chinese grandeur. He summoned Chinese architects, Persian engineers, and Tibetan monks. The layout followed traditional Chinese geomantic principles, aligned to the cardinal directions, ringed with walls and gates, centered around the palace, but infused with the multicultural fabric of the empire. Dadu was not just a city, it was a message. We are not guests in China, we rule it. To legitimize his rule in the eyes of the Chinese people and Confucian elite, Kublai took a bold step. In 1271, he proclaimed the establishment of the Yuan Dynasty Da Yuan. Taking the reign title, Shizu, he styled himself not merely as Khagan of the Mongols, but Huangdi Emperor of China. "The Yuan shall inherit both heaven and earth," he declared. Its root is the steppes, its branches, the world. It was a radical transformation. The first time in Chinese history that a foreign conqueror created a fully Sinicized dynasty, not just as a ruling power, but as a legitimate Chinese dynasty in name, structure, and symbolism. Kublai's vision was ambitious, to rule not just Mongols, but Han Chinese, Tibetans, Persians, Uyghurs, and countless others. He restructured the government based on a four-class system: Mongols, Semu-Central Asians, Muslims, etc., Northern Chinese, Southern Chinese, the last to be conquered. While controversial and hierarchical, this system allowed him to reward loyalty while managing tension among conquered peoples. He retained many Chinese civil institutions, but placed trusted Mongol and Semu officials at critical junctures. He relied heavily on the Secretariat, Censorate, and Privy Council, blending Chinese governance with steppe pragmatism. But even as he adapted, he did not lose his roots. His court retained Mongol rituals, steppe music, and traditional clothing, a living symbol of the balance he was building. Kublai Khan was not merely a general or emperor, he was a patron of knowledge. He welcomed scholars from across the known world. Muslim astronomers helped reform the calendar. Tibetan lamas gained influence at court. Nestorian Christians served as advisors. Even Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, arrived at Kublai's court in the 1270s and stayed for nearly 2 decades. He established schools, libraries, and translation bureaus. He funded Confucian academies while inviting Buddhist and Taoist scholars to engage in open debates. Kublai's rule reflected a cosmopolitan spirit, one where swords and scrolls shared the same table. Under Kublai's early reign, China saw signs of recovery and progress. The Grand Canal was repaired and extended, improving grain transport. Paper currency Chow became widespread, facilitating commerce. New roads and postal stations stretched across Asia, linking Dadu to Baghdad and beyond. Agricultural handbooks were published to support peasant reforms. Kublai also promoted drama, painting, and storytelling. The Yuan Dynasty would become famous for its theatrical works, such as Zaju opera, which flourished with imperial support. While conflict lingered with the southern song, the northern realm began to stabilize under his rule. Yet not all were pleased. Traditional Mongol nobles grumbled that their Khan now sat on a throne, wore hand robes, and dined with chopsticks. Kineze literati, while impressed by Kublai's reforms, often viewed his dynasty as foreign and imposed. He was an outsider who had learned their books but not earned their hearts. Still, Kublai pressed on, neither fully Mongol nor fully Chinese, but something new, something imperial. On the eve of the Yuan's declaration, Kublai sat alone in the Hall of Heaven. In his hands, a jade seal engraved with dragons, and a bow passed down from his grandfather, Genghis. He placed both on the altar. "Let heaven judge me," he whispered. "Not as a Mongol, not as a Chinese, but as a ruler of men." The wind outside carried the sound of drums, not for war, but for a dynasty just born. And thus, China had a new emperor, and the world a new era. Some kingdoms are taken with fire, others surrender to time. But the South resisted until its last breath. Though Kublai Khan had declared the founding of the Yuan Dynasty in 1271, his dominion over China was incomplete. The Southern Song Dynasty, ruling from Lin and modern-day Hangzhou, still held vast, wealthy, and fiercely defended lands. It was more than a political rival. It was a symbol of Han legitimacy, a dynasty of poets, scholars, and stubborn generals. For Kublai to rule all of China, the South must fall. The Song were no fools. They had watched the fall of the Jin, the rise of the Mongol Empire, and now the declaration of a foreign Yuan dynasty. Their response was defiance. Southern China was rich in rivers, canals, and mountains, a nightmare for the steppe cavalry. The Yangtze River served as a natural wall. Song generals like Wen Tianzhang, Zhang Shijie, and Lu Xiufu knew how to delay, outmaneuver, and retreat deep into terrain. Mongols found alien, most critically. The twin fortress cities of Xiangyang and Fancheng guarded the northern gateway to the heart of Song territory. Without them, there would be no passage south. The siege of Xiangyang was one of the longest and most critical military campaigns of Kublai's reign. For nearly 5 years, the Yuan forces encircled the cities but could not breach them. The Song had built thick walls, sustained supply routes, and an iron resistance. But Kublai was patient. He appointed General Bayan, one of his most trusted commanders, to lead the campaign. Bayan, pragmatic and relentless, turned to foreign innovation. Kublai enlisted Muslim engineers from Persia, who brought with them the secrets of counterweight trebuchets, powerful siege engines that could hurl 300-pound stones over long distances. The first time these machines fired, they shattered towers that had withstood years of bombardment. The balance tipped. By 1273, both Xiangyang and Fancheng fell. The gate to the south had been broken. "The Yangtze shall not save you now," Bayan declared as the walls crumbled. Conquering the Song meant fighting on rivers. The Song Navy was formidable, with fleets of armored paddleships, floating fortresses, and highly maneuverable riverboats. They controlled the canals and were masters of water warfare. In response, Kublai invested in a Mongol navy, a concept alien to steppe warriors. He commissioned Chinese shipwrights to build massive fleets. Thousands of soldiers were trained in naval tactics. Entire ports were constructed along the Yangtze. The Mongols, once conquerors of the desert and grassland, now became warlords of the water. Battle after battle, they pushed the Song Navy southward, city by city. In 1276, the Yuan forces finally reached Linen, the southern Song capital. The emperor at the time was a child, barely 4 years old. With resistance crumbling and internal divisions growing, Linen surrendered without a full siege. Kublai ordered his forces to spare the city and its people, a move that impressed many and softened the blow of conquest. The boy emperor was sent to Dadu, treated well, but kept as a symbol. The Song were finished, or so it seemed. Several loyalists, including Zhang Shijie and Lu Xiufu, refused to surrender. They carried the last Song Emperor Zhao Bing, another child, into exile on the sea. They formed a floating court, drifting from island to island, refusing to kneel. But in 1279, Kublai's navy cornered them at Yamen, near modern-day Guangdong. The battle was fierce, fought entirely on ships. Wen forces surrounded the Song fleet, cutting off all escape. With defeat certain, Lu Xiufu carried the young emperor in his arms and jumped into the sea, choosing death over submission. Thousands followed. The water ran red. The Song was gone. With the fall of the southern Song, Kublai Khan became the first non-Han ruler to unify all of China under one dynasty. From the steppes of Mongolia to the beaches of Hainan, from Tibet to the Korean peninsula. The Yuan Empire now spanned all of East Asia. The rivers no longer divide. Kublai proclaimed, "They connect what is mine." He had done what no warlord had done since Qin Shi Huang, united China under one rule. But unlike Qin, he was not of China. He had become China. Kublai ordered monuments for the Song emperors. He employed former Song officials. He even preserved many Confucian temples and shrines. Yet the wounds lingered. Many Chinese would mourn the Song for generations, not just as a lost dynasty, but as a symbol of Chinese identity under foreign rule. Kublai knew this, and yet he stood at the pinnacle of power, the great Khan, the son of heaven, and now the emperor of all under heaven. The conquest was complete. The ruling had just begun. There are empires built on conquest, and there are those built on curiosity. By the 1280s, Kublai Khan stood at the summit of the known world. He had unified China under the Yuan Dynasty, presided over the most diverse court in history, and commanded a transcontinental empire stretching from the Pacific to the Danube. But what happens when the warlord becomes the emperor? When the conqueror must now govern? This was the test of Kublai's true greatness, not in fire and blood, but in law, tolerance, and vision. The imperial court at Dadu, Beijing became a marvel of diplomacy, scholarship, and spectacle. Kublai transformed it into a global crossroads, a place where Mongol generals, Chinese mandarins, Persian astronomers, Tibetan monks, Russian envoys, and Indian merchants all stood beneath the same roof. Court rituals fused steppe traditions and Chinese ceremony. Meals were served in gold bowls with fermented Mars milk beside green tea. Proclamations were issued in 4 languages: Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, and Uyghur. The court was a symbol of his empire's plurality, a display of tolerance and order unseen since Rome. "Let the world come to me," Kublai once said, "and they shall find their place at my table." In 1275, a young Venetian named Marco Polo arrived at Kublai's court with his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo. They came bearing gifts from Europe, including holy oil from Jerusalem and papal letters. But what impressed Kublai was Marco's curiosity, adaptability, and language skills. Soon, Marco became an official in the Yuan court, a foreign advisor tasked with observing the empire and reporting back. He was sent to Yunnan, Hangzhou, and even the borders of Burma and India to Marco. The Mongol Empire was a world beyond imagination. Paper money in use, efficient postal systems across thousands of miles, urban centers full of markets, gardens, and theaters, religious freedom enshrined by decree. The great Khan governs not with fear, but with marvel. Marco wrote, under Kublai's reign, the Silk Road entered a golden age. Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, allowed merchants, scholars, and diplomats to travel freely from Venice to Chang'an. From Baghdad to Delhi, trade flourished. Silk, porcelain, gunpowder, and tea flowed west. Glassware, spices, textiles, and scientific texts flowed east. Caravans passed through well-guarded routes, aided by Yam stations' postal relays every 25 miles, stocked with horses and supplies. The empire became a network, not just of conquest, but of commerce. Kublai understood ideas are more powerful than armies and far more enduring. Kublai was no ideologue. He saw religion not as truth, but as a tool of unity. He supported Tibetan Buddhism, his personal faith, Confucianism, to appease Chinese elites, Islam, embraced by many of his administrators, Nestorian Christianity, through which he corresponded with Europe. He abolished the imperial civil service exams, seen as biased toward Confucian scholars, though this decision would later be controversial. He placed trust in competence, not origin appointing Muslims, Persians, and Central Asians to high office, even above Chinese literati. This multi-ethnic bureaucracy was efficient, but also unstable. Balancing loyalties became ever more delicate. The Yuan court patronized art, science, drama, and literature. Zaju theater thrived, blending music, acrobatics, and narrative, often retelling stories of love, betrayal, and loyalty. Calligraphy and painting evolved under Mongol influence, incorporating Persian and Central Asian motifs. Map-making and astronomy advanced with the help of Muslim scholars. Kublai even commissioned a world map, placing Dadu at the center, a cartographic expression of imperial confidence. In his court, art was not a luxury. It was a statement of empire. Behind the splendor, Kublai's private life grew more complex. He deeply loved his wife Chabi, a devout Buddhist and wise political advisor. Her death in 1281 devastated him. Later, he withdrew from public life, struggled with depression and gout, and grew increasingly indulgent in food and wine. His health declined. His court grew factional. He had reached the peak and now stood alone atop a mountain built from years of sacrifice. "The world is mine," he once said to a court poet, "but the fire that took it has gone cold in my chest." In the gardens of Xanadu, the emperor sat beneath a willow, watching silk lanterns drift across a lake. Marco Polo stood beside him, silent. "What will you write of me?" Kublai asked. "That you ruled with wisdom," Marco answered. "No." The emperor smiled. "Say only this, that I saw a world no one else dared to imagine, and dared to make it real. Above them, behind the stars, turned over a realm like no other. The ocean has no roads, yet emperors try to ride across it on the backs of thunder. Kublai Khan ruled the largest land empire the world had ever seen. But still, it wasn't enough. He dreamed of islands bowing to his throne, of tropical jungles yielding to Mongol steel. In his mind, all under heaven meant all. But the ocean does not bend like the steppe, and in its waves, even great khans can drown. Kublai sent envoys to Japan in the early 1270s, demanding tribute from the Kamakura shogunate. Their reply, silence. In 1274, Kublai launched the first of two invasions, assembling 900 ships. Though entirely, no revolt of Mongol, Korean, and Chinese troops, they landed at Hakata Bay, armed with new weapons, gunpowder bombs, flamethrowers, and brutal efficiency. The Japanese samurai, used to ritualized single combat, were overwhelmed by Mongol formations and coordinated assaults. But then nature intervened. A typhoon struck the Mongol fleet as they attempted to consolidate their foothold. Hundreds of ships were destroyed. Thousands of men drowned. The survivors limped home. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. Kublai was not deterred. In 1281, he ordered a second, even larger assault. 400 ships, over 140 Zero troops, two invasion forces converging from China and Korea. They attacked again at Hakata Bay, only to face fierce resistance. Japanese forces had fortified the coastline with walls and prepared defenses. For weeks, the invaders were trapped between a hostile shore and the open sea. Then, once again, a massive typhoon hit. This time, even more destructive. Ships splintered, men were tossed like leaves. Out of 140, nevertheless, only a fraction returned. It was the largest naval disaster in history until World War II. While Japan's islands proved unreachable, Kublai turned his gaze southward toward Jai Viet, modern-day Vietnam, ruled by the Yuan Dynasty. In 1257, the Mongols launched their first invasion and briefly occupied Thung Long Hanoi, but tropical disease and guerrilla tactics forced a retreat. In 1284, a second campaign was launched under Prince Togon, Kublai's son. But Jai Viet generals like Tran Hung Jiao waged asymmetric warfare, striking supply lines, vanishing into jungles, and wearing down the invaders. In 1288, the famed Battle of Bac Giang River occurred. Vietnamese forces lured Mongol ships into the tidal trap, where submerged stakes ripped through their hulls as the tide fell. Kublai's fleet was annihilated. His son fled. Jai Viet remained free. In 1293, Kublai tried again this time, targeting the island kingdom of Singasari in Java, modern Indonesia. He sent 20 men by sea to intervene in a local civil war. At first, they succeeded, but local resistance and disease quickly turned the tide. Javanese fighters used the terrain volcanoes, swamps, and jungle ambushes to devastating effect. Supplies dwindled. The fleet was stranded. The Mongols withdrew, humiliated. The tropics had crushed them without a single major pitched battle. These defeats marked a turning point in Kublai's reign. His treasury drained, his armies stretched thin, his ambitions questioned. For the first time, the myth of Mongol invincibility cracked. His enemies learned. You could not always beat the Mongols with force, but you could outlast them, outwit them, and let their own reach collapse inward. Kublai began to age rapidly. The fire dimmed, the edge dulled. He remained the emperor of the greatest empire on earth. But even the heavens have borders. In his private hall, Kublai stood before a map etched in jade. He traced his finger from Dadu, across the rivers of Vietnam, the coasts of Japan, the jungles of Java, places that refused him. Behind him, an old admiral whispered, "The sea has no master." Kublai nodded. "Then let it keep its crown," he said, and turned away. To conquer is to burn with fire, but to rule is to survive the ashes. By the 1290s, Kublai Khan no longer resembled the young warrior who rode beneath the banners of Genghis. He had aged into a shadow of his former self, overweight, racked by pain, and surrounded by ghosts. He still wore the dragon robe, still ruled from Dadu, still spoke with the voice of an emperor. But inside, the fire flickered. The twilight of his reign had begun. No loss struck Kublai more deeply than that of his wife, Empress Chabi. Chabi had been more than consort. She was his confidant, his conscience, his political advisor. A devout Buddhist, she tempered his aggression, softened his rule, and helped maintain harmony in court. When she died in 1281, Kublai withdrew from public ceremonies. He wept openly, refused to eat for days, and rejected offers of remarriage. "She was the light by which I ruled," he told a court monk. "Now I walk in mist." From that point on, his depression deepened. Years of stress, overeating, and sorrow took their toll. Kublai developed severe gout, often confined to a wheelchair, obesity, reportedly weighing over 300 pounds, chronic fatigue and mood swings. He became irritable, withdrawing from court matters. His judgment slowed, and power increasingly shifted to ministers and eunuchs. He surrounded himself with entertainers, jesters, and astrologers, a retreat into distraction. The once vibrant ruler who had debated Confucians and conquered dynasties now spoke less, smiled rarely, and ruled by habit. Kublai's court, once a symbol of multicultural vigor, began to crack. Factions emerged between Mongol nobles, Chinese bureaucrats, and foreign administrators. Corruption spread in tax offices and provincial governments. His sons, Nomukhan and Genghis, vied for influence, each backed by different factions. Plots and poisonings increased. His chosen heir, Genghis, was a wise and competent prince, deeply Confucian and widely respected. But in 1286, Genghis died suddenly, likely from stress and alcoholism. Kublai was never the same. He would outlive many of his children, each loss leaving him more hollow than before. Outside the palace, the empire itself began to strain. Mongol governors clashed with Chinese local leaders. The southern territories, recently conquered, struggled with rebellion. Buddhist and Taoist sects competed for imperial favor, sparking rural unrest. Tax burdens increased to fund failed military campaigns. Even the Silk Road, once a thriving artery of trade, began to feel the tremors of instability. The grandeur remained, but the center no longer held. In his final years, Kublai often asked to be wheeled into the Hall of Ancestors, where golden tablets bore the names of Genghis Khan and the early Khans. He sat silently before them, sometimes for hours. "Did I fulfill your vision?" he whispered one night, speaking to no one. "Or did I lose it, chasing dragons made of clouds?" He commissioned historians to write official accounts of his reign, but ordered multiple versions. He was no longer sure which Kublai he wanted remembered. In early 1294, Kublai Khan fell gravely ill. He stopped attending council, Food lost all taste. He refused visitors, except monks. One winter morning, he asked to be brought outside into the garden, under falling snow. There, surrounded by silence, he looked south toward the lands he had once taken, now blurred by mist. He closed his eyes. "Let them remember the storm," he said, "not the man it left behind." He died that night, aged 79. Emperor, great Khan, grandfather, ghost. After his death, his grandson Timur Khan succeeded him. The Yuan Dynasty would continue, but it would never again shine as it had under Kublai. His death marked the end of the Mongol Golden Age. Not with conquest, not with rebellion, but with a man simply growing old, outliving even his own myth. No ruler chooses how he is remembered. The dead become stories, and stories, like empires, are shaped by those left behind. Kublai Khan was gone. The man who once ruled from the Pacific to Persia, who bent mountains and maps to his will, had left the world. But what remained? Statues crumble, cities change names, thrones are forgotten. Yet names echo, and Kublai Khan would echo for centuries. In China, Kublai's legacy was ambivalent. He had unified the territory, adopted Chinese imperial rituals, revived the economy, supported Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist institutions. But he was still a foreigner. Numenihan literati? The Yuan Dynasty was an aberration, a Mongol imposition interrupting the natural flow of Chinese dynasties. Kublai's use of foreign administrators, the abolition of civil service exams, and his favoring of non-Han elites left a bitter taste. Confucian historians of the Ming Dynasty, which followed the Yuan, described him as a clever usurper, not a true son of heaven. Yet others acknowledged his administrative genius, his tolerance, and his deep efforts to integrate two civilizations. He wore the dragon robe, wrote one Ming historian, but his heart still rode horses. Among the Mongols, Kublai was both legend and cautionary tale. Some revered him as the heir to Genghis Khan's dream, a conqueror who brought China to heel, the only descendant to rule both as Great Khan and Chinese emperor. But others whispered that he had betrayed the steppe by settling in cities, by preferring scrolls over saddles, by building palaces instead of yurts. To the princes of the Western Khanate, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai, the ill-Khanate Kublai had become too Chinese, too distant, and no longer their equal. The Mongol world never reunited after his rise. In a way, his glory fractured the empire. In Europe, Kublai Khan became almost mythic thanks to Marco Polo. Polo's Il Milione, The Travels of Marco Polo, published in the early 14th century, painted Kublai as a wise philosopher king, a just lawgiver, a ruler of wonders with cities of gold, mechanical fountains, and paper money, to a Europe still feudal and fractured. Polo's descriptions were unbelievable, and yet utterly compelling. In the East, there is a Khan greater than all kings, Polo wrote, and he sits in a palace where the walls are made of silver, and the justice weighs heavier than gold. His book influenced explorers like Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy with him, cartographers shaping maps of Asia, poets, painters, and dreamers envisioning the Orient. Through Polo's eyes, Kublai became more than emperor, he became legend. Even beyond politics, Kublai's reign had a profound cultural ripple. Buddhism spread deeper into China through his support of Tibetan clergy. Wen drama and theater laid the groundwork for later Chinese operatic forms. Artistic fusion between Mongol, Chinese, Persian, and Tibetan styles flourished. Multilingual administration, Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, Uyghur influenced future dynasties. The Yuan postal system, coinage reforms, and urban planning innovations lived on. Though his dynasty fell in 1368, much of the institutional framework remained in Ming China, a testament to his long-term vision. But not all legacies are clean. Kublai's empire slowly decayed under successors who lacked his strength. The four Khanates drifted apart permanently. The Mongols would never again hold China. In Mongol epics, Kublai appears only briefly overshadowed by Genghis. In Chinese annals, he's remembered with measured respect, not reverence. In the West, he became more dream than man. Each culture took a piece of him, but none claimed him entirely. A century later, in a caravanserai near Samarkand, A Persian storyteller begins his tale. There once was a Khan who ruled both deserts and dragons, who spoke to monks and merchants alike, who tried to conquer the sea and failed, but conquered a world within his reach. A child leans forward. Was he like Genghis? The old man smiles. No, he says. Genghis tore the world open. Kublai tried to stitch it together. A dynasty is a fire. It burns brightest in one man's hands, then flickers in the shadows of those who follow. Kublai Khan had built an empire like no other, vast, multicultural, and magnificent. But when the man who held it all together died, he left behind more than a throne. He left behind expectation, and few could bear its weight. After Kublai's death in 1294, power passed to his grandson, Temur Khan, Emperor Chengzong of Yuan. Temur was competent, cautious, and respectful of his grandfather's legacy. He maintained peace with the Western Khanates, resumed the civil service exam system to win over Han elites, curbed heavy military campaigns, but he lacked Kublai's charisma and boldness. He ruled not as a visionary, but as a caretaker. Under Temur, the empire stabilized briefly, but the rot had begun. After Timur's death in 1307, a series of short-lived, weak emperors followed. The Yuan court became a battleground for Mongol aristocrats fighting over court positions, eunuchs and ministers running shadow governments, provincial governors acting independently. Without a strong emperor, the imperial court fractured into factions, bribery, favoritism, and revenge poisoned decisions. No longer united by vision, the dynasty became reactive, not strategic. The empire's economy, once booming under Kublai, began to falter. Overprinting of paper currency led to inflation. Heavy taxes caused unrest, especially in southern China. Famine and plague hit rural areas. Trade on the Silk Road declined as internal instability discouraged merchants. Foreign confidence in Yuan coinage eroded. Peasants in the south whispered of rebellion. Secret societies like the White Lotus sect began to organize underground resistance. The dragon's scales had begun to peel. Outside of China, the once great Mongol Empire disintegrated. The Golden Horde in Russia embraced Islam and drifted further from Yuan influence. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed in the 1330s. The Chagatai Khanate split into eastern and western domains. Communication between the Khanates broke down. Rival Khans no longer attended a shared Kurultai. The dream of Genghis' one empire under heaven was dead. The Yuan court still called Kublai's descendants great Khans, but none outside China listened anymore. By the mid-1300s, China was a volcano. Floods of the Yellow River displaced millions. Local bandits became regional warlords. The imperial army, poorly funded and fractured, could not respond fast enough. In 1351, the Red Turban Rebellion erupted, a peasant movement inspired by Buddhism, anti-Mongol resentment, and folk prophecy. They declared the Yuan had lost the mandate of heaven. Leaders like Zhu Yuanzhang, a former monk and military genius, rose to prominence. He would one day become the founder of the Ming Dynasty. But for now, he was a thorn that Yuan emperors could not remove. The final Yuan emperor, Dogon Temura, was a tragic figure, more poet than prince, more mystic than monarch. He fled the capital rather than fight rebels, obsessed over alchemy, astrology, and dreams, wrote poetry about the fading glories of empire. Once I stood at the center of all under heaven. He wrote, now I am a shadow wandering through dust. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces captured Dadu. The city fell without a proper siege. Togon Timur fled north to Chengdu, the summer capital of his grandfather, and died there years later, in obscurity. The Yuan dynasty was over in China, but not everywhere. The Mongol elite who escaped retreated to the steppe and founded the Northern Yuan, a continuation of the dynasty in name, if not in substance. They claimed to be the rightful heirs of Genghis and Kublai, and for nearly 2 more centuries, they would resist Chinese rule from the north. But the world had changed. China had returned to Han rule under the Ming. The Mongols were no longer feared, but contained. In the abandoned throne room of Dadu, moss began to creep up the stone pillars. Banners hung in silence. A soldier of the new Ming regime passed through the court. He paused, looking up at the empty dragon throne. "What kind of man ruled from here?" he asked. The scribe beside him replied, "A man who believed the world could be one, but forgot that the world has many hearts. History remembers the loud, but it is shaped by those who listened, who waited, who dared to dream beyond their blood." Kublai Khan was born beneath the endless sky of the steppe. He died as Emperor of China. But between those 2 points lies more than a life. It holds an era, a continent transformed, and a man who lived between worlds that rarely met. Now, his bones rest somewhere beneath the sacred mountains of Mongolia, lost to time, as he wished. But his shadow still stretches across empires. What was Kublai Khan? A conqueror, born from the blood of Genghis. A statesman who understood that governance required more than terror. A visionary who believed Mongols could build, not just burn. He was the only Mongol who fully embraced Chinese imperial rule, founded a dynasty recognized by both East and West, turned the Mongol legacy from nomadic wrath to structured order. He did not merely inherit an empire, he reshaped it. Under Kublai Khan, the Yuan Dynasty unified China for the first time in centuries. A multi-ethnic bureaucracy emerged, mixing Mongol, Chinese, Persian, and Turkic minds. The Silk Road reached its apex as goods and ideas flowed freely. Religious tolerance became policy, not exception. Urban centers flourished, and science, drama, and literature thrived. And yet, his foreign wars drained the treasury. His successors could not hold the throne. The dream of a united Mongol world died with him. Kublai Khan won China, but lost the empire. Kublai believed in the power of synthesis. He wore Mongol boots beneath a Chinese robe. He spoke several languages, listened to monks and merchants alike. He placed engineers above generals and scrolls beside swords. He understood that to rule people, one must understand their stories, not just their borders. Where Genghis conquered through fear, Kublai ruled through structure. His belief: the power must transform, or it will collapse. Few figures in world history bridged cultures like Kublai Khan, between nomad and emperor, between East and West, between myth and man. His court hosted Buddhists from Tibet, Christians from Syria, Muslims from Central Asia, Venetians like Marco Polo. He showed that the world could be one stage, if only for a moment, not forever. No, but long enough to leave a blueprint. In the centuries after his death, the Yuan Dynasty became a chapter admired, debated, misunderstood. The Ming Dynasty rose, but inherited many Yuan policies. The Mongols retreated, but would forever be part of Chinese and Asian history. In modern times, historians see Kublai as a flawed but brilliant ruler, a transitional figure between violence and civilization, a symbol of how hybrid leadership can create brief moments of greatness. His story became a source of national pride in Mongolia, a chapter of complex identity in China, a romanticized marvel in the West. Somewhere in Central Asia, a lone rider travels the steppe, reading from a leather-bound scroll. It tells the tale of a man born to ride horses, who came to rule cities, of a boy taught under open sky, who built a court of marble and silk, of a ruler who lost battles at sea, but won hearts across a continent. The rider stops, looks up at the stars, the same stars Kublai once stared at in his youth. They called him Khan, they called him Emperor, but maybe he was just possible. And the wind carries the name onward. Kublai, not as legend, but as a question: what can one life, one mind, one dream truly shape?